John Wesley Hardin's most notorious crime isn't just his 40 documented murders, it is his hypocritical attempt to whitewash his bloody legacy. The truth behind the Texas Outlaw is that he used a newly acquired law degree and tailored suits to hide a severe gambling and alcohol addiction. The mass murderer who once commanded a $4,000 state bounty didn't die in a legendary shootout. He was assassinated with a bullet to the back of the head while rolling dice in a saloon, proving his reformed intellectual persona was a complete illusion. A respected intellectual stands in a quiet room, his features composed, projecting the quiet dignity of a man dedicated to the law. Across the Texas dirt lies a cold-blooded killer, leaving a chaotic trail of over 40 shattered corpses in his wake. He was baptized with the name of a deeply revered religious founder, raised in the pious, disciplined home of a devout preacher, and destined from birth to deliver sermons and save the souls of his community. This is John Wesley Hardin. Why did a boy born into absolute faith and rigid moral discipline mutate into the most prolific and unrepentant murderer the American West had ever seen? The environment that forged him was entirely devoid of the desperation that birthed so many other violent men of his era. He was not starved into a life of crime, nor was he driven out of his home by marauding soldiers or oppressive corporations. He grew up in a structured, respectable household. His father was a Methodist preacher and a circuit rider, a man who traveled the harsh Texas frontier delivering the gospel, demanding strict adherence to biblical morality. His mother was a woman of firm, uncompromising values. The Hardin home was filled with the sounds of daily prayers, the reading of scripture, and the heavy expectation of righteousness. The community looked at the preacher's son and saw a future pillar of the church, a boy who would eventually step up to the pulpit. But beneath the Sunday shy, cool hymns and the quiet obedience, a profound and terrifying psychological defect was taking root. The empathy and moral boundaries preached by his father never took root. In their place grew a cold, absolute detachment from human suffering. The violent fracture of this religious facade occurred shockingly early. At the age of 14, an age when most boys were helping with the harvest or studying their school books, the darkness within him manifested in a sudden burst of extreme aggression. During a trivial schoolyard dispute, he skipped the typical fist fight entirely, drawing a knife and driving the blade directly into his classmate. The terrifying aspect of this incident was not just the physical act of stabbing, but the absolute lack of standard emotional fallout. There were no tears of regret, no frantic apologies, no crisis of conscience. He viewed the violent escalation as a perfectly acceptable resolution to a minor conflict. This was the first undeniable indicator that the preacher's son was fundamentally lacking the basic human mechanism of empathy. He was a predator incubating in a pew. A year later, at the age of 15, the blade was replaced by a revolver, and the violence escalated from assault to a permanent taking of life. The victim was a former slave named Mage. The catalyst for the murder was entirely mundane, stemming from a petty disagreement following a wrestling match. A normal teenager might have shouted insults or walked away angry. He drew his weapon and fired multiple rounds directly into Mage, executing the man in the dirt. When the smoke cleared and the heavy scent of black powder hung in the air, the 15-year-old boy looked down at his first corpse. The psychological threshold had been crossed, and he felt absolutely no remorse. There was no frantic run to his father for spiritual absolution, nor any confession to the authorities. He simply wiped the blood from his hands, holstered his weapon, and calculated his next move with a precision of a seasoned sociopath. This initial kill unlocked the floodgates. He abandoned his home, his family name, and the entire moral framework of his upbringing, plunging headfirst into the chaotic, lawless underbelly of post-Civil War Texas. Hardin harbored no grand political agenda. Unlike the romanticized outlaws who fought railroad barons or redistributed wealth, he operated purely on bloodlust. By every modern metric, he was a serial killer exploiting a lawless environment. He was, by every modern psychological definition, a serial killer operating in an environment that lacked the forensic infrastructure to stop him. He traveled from town to town, haunting the saloons, the cattle trails, and the gambling dens. He became a hyper-vigilant, heavily armed drifter, constantly scanning his environment for the slightest provocation. His triggers for lethal violence were horrifyingly trivial. A genuine threat to his life was entirely unnecessary to provoke lethal force. A bruised ego, a cross-look, or a minor inconvenience was all it took. The sheer volume of his slaughter terrified the entire region. He personally claimed to have extinguished the lives of over 40 men. He shot men over minor disagreements concerning the rules of card games. He shot men for looking at him the wrong way across a crowded barroom. In one of the most chilling demonstrations of his absolute disregard for human life, he once fired a bullet directly through the wall of his hotel room, killing the man sleeping in the adjacent bed, simply because the stranger was snoring too loudly and interrupting his rest. To him, human beings were not individuals with families, histories, and rights. They were temporary obstacles or minor annoyances that could be permanently removed with a slight pressure of his index finger. He treated the act of taking a life as casually as ordering a drink. He documented these killings in his own writings, not as confessions of a tortured soul, but as boastful accounts of his superior speed and tactical dominance. He fetishized the mechanics of the draw, the weight of the gun, and the exact placement of the bullet. He viewed his soaring body count as a twisted scoreboard, a testament to his untouchable status on the frontier. The public, deeply unsettled by the random, unpredictable nature of his violence, demanded action. The authorities recognized that they were not dealing with a standard horse thief or a stagecoach robber. They were dealing with a rabid, highly lethal anomaly that was actively depopulating the state. The response from the government was unprecedented. The state of Texas, desperate to bring the massacre to an end, placed an astronomical bounty on his head. They offered a reward of $4,000 for his capture. This was a massive, life-altering fortune, equivalent to the entire lifetime earnings of an average working man. The issuance of this staggering sum fundamentally altered his reality. It transformed him from a solitary predator into the most valuable prey in the American West. Every bounty hunter, every desperate cowboy, and every corrupt lawman in the state suddenly had a massive financial incentive to put a bullet in his back. The hunter was now being hunted by an entire society. Yet the massive bounty did not force him into quiet exile. It fueled his paranoia and accelerated his violence. He knew that any man walking through the saloon doors could be holding a warrant and a shotgun. He lived in a state of constant, suffocating hypervigilance, trusting no one, sleeping with his weapons in his hands, ready to kill at a moment's notice to protect his own skin. The boy named after the founder of a peaceful religion had become the absolute embodiment of localized terror, a walking plague of lead and gunpowder, entirely unburdened by conscience and fueled by the relentless, paranoid drive to survive at any bloody cost. The transition from a free-roaming mass murderer to a heavily shackled inmate of the Huntsville Penitentiary was not the result of a sudden, dramatic gunfight on the Texas plains. It was the culmination of a highly sophisticated interstate intelligence operation that completely dismantled Hardin's very first attempt at corporate camouflage. The massive $4,000 bounty placed upon his head by the state of Texas had fundamentally altered the operational logistics of his survival. The open frontier was no longer a vast hunting ground. It had transformed into a highly militarized grid populated by state authorities and heavily armed bounty hunters incentivized by life-altering wealth. Recognizing that his physical termination was a mathematical certainty if he remained within the state's borders, he executed a massive geographical relocation. In 1874, following the lynching of his brother, he orchestrated the clandestine movement of his wife Jane and his closest associates, crossing multiple state lines and vanishing into the dense, humid swamps of Florida and southern Alabama. Here, in the deep isolation of the American South, Hardin initiated his prototype rebranding effort. He recognized early on that a firearm could only provide temporary security. Long-term survival required the acquisition of legitimate social and financial capital. He completely shed the toxic, highly publicized identity of John Wesley Hardin and officially adopted the legal alias J.H. Swain. This was not a desperate, impoverished exile where he hid trembling in a cabin. He actively utilized the illicit capital accumulated from years of robbery and violent extortion to integrate himself deeply into the local economy. He established a legitimate commercial footprint, purchasing a lucrative logging enterprise, running cattle, and occasionally managing a local saloon. The apex predator had effectively transitioned into a respectable, hard-working agricultural businessman. He paid taxes, interacted with local merchants, and attempted to launder his own bloody existence, utilizing the sheer geographical distance from Texas to insulate his new life from his immense karmic debt. However, the maintenance of a fabricated corporate identity requires absolute, uncompromising operational security, a discipline that his towering narcissistic ego completely failed to sustain. The fatal vulnerability of his Florida syndicate was not a failure of his logging business or an exposure by the local citizenry, but a catastrophic failure in his communications protocol. Despite the massive lethal bounty on his head, he flatly refused to sever ties with his criminal and familial network back in Texas. He routinely sent letters and financial drafts across state lines, utilizing his father-in-law, Neil Bowen, and a network of intermediaries to mask his location. In the late 19th century, this continuous paper trail was the equivalent of a highly visible digital footprint, and the state of Texas had deployed highly specialized operatives specifically trained to track it. The manhunt was spearheaded by Texas Ranger John B. Armstrong, a relentless, methodical investigator operating alongside a network of undercover detectives, including Jack Duncan. Armstrong did not rely on galloping horses and blind luck to locate his target. He functioned as a forensic accountant of the underworld. The investigators meticulously intercepted the mail network, bribed local postal workers, and analyzed the geographical postmarks on the letters sent to Hardin's family. Through painstaking intelligence gathering, they successfully breached Hardin's communication firewall, systematically triangulating the exact location of the fictitious J.H. Swain. The state of Texas had successfully bypassed Hardin's formidable physical defenses by tracking his administrative and logistical errors. In August 1877, the intelligence gathering phase officially transitioned into a kinetic extraction. Ranger Armstrong secured federal warrants and traveled to Pensacola, Florida, coordinating a joint operational strike with local Escambia County law enforcement. The tactical execution of the arrest was brilliant, specifically designed by Armstrong to neutralize Hardin's legendary speed with a revolver. The authorities did not challenge the killer to a theatrical shootout on an open, dusty street where Hardin's feral reflexes would provide a lethal advantage. Instead, Armstrong orchestrated an ambush within the heavily confined, highly restrictive, and chaotic architecture of a passenger train car. As the train idled at the Pensacola Railway Depot preparing for departure, Armstrong and his heavily armed detachment stormed the narrow aisles of the smoking car where Hardin and his associates were seated. The resulting confrontation was a brutal, deafening explosion of close-quarters violence. When the cornered predator realized the trap had sprung, his immediate hard-wired instinct was to draw his weapon and shoot his way out. But the cramped wooden seating, the panicked civilians, and the element of total surprise fatally compromised his biomechanics. Before Hardin could level his revolver, Armstrong opened fire, shooting one of Hardin's associates, Jim Mann, who attempted to flee through a window. In the ensuing chaos, Hardin experienced a humiliating, catastrophic mechanical failure. In his frantic attempt to draw his customized Colt revolver, the hammer became hopelessly snagged in the fabric of his own suspenders. This exact, pathetic mechanical malfunction perfectly foreshadowed the manner in which he would eventually be assassinated 18 years later in El Paso. He was paralyzed by his own clothing. Armstrong did not waste a bullet on the primary target. He lunged forward, closed the distance, and violently crushed the heavy steel barrel of his Colt revolver directly against Hardin's skull. The impact instantly rendered the most feared, prolific gunman in the American West completely unconscious, dropping him to the floor of the train car in a pool of his own blood. The physical capture of the asset was only the initial phase of the operation. The subsequent logistical nightmare was the transcontinental extradition. Transporting a highly lethal, high-value target with a $4,000 bounty across multiple state jurisdictions required a massive security apparatus. Armstrong bound his unconscious prisoner in heavy iron chains, securing him in specialized, locked rail cars. The primary threat during the transit was not just Hardin attempting an escape, but the very real possibility of rival bounty hunters or vigilante mobs ambushing the train to claim the reward or execute immediate frontier justice. The return journey to Texas was a highly publicized, heavily guarded corporate transit. The man who had terrorized the frontier as an untouchable ghost-like phantom was paraded back into the state as a defeated, shackled piece of state property. The capture in Pensacola completely shattered the grand illusion of his invincibility. It proved definitively that geographical relocation and superficial business fronts could not permanently insulate a criminal from a highly funded interstate law enforcement apparatus. This violent extraction from the Florida swamps delivered him directly into the cold, grinding gears of the Texas judicial machine, setting the absolute stage for the crushing 25-year prison sentence that would force his subsequent desperate descent into religious and legal hypocrisy. The sheer volume of his slaughter eventually forced the hand of the authorities, ending his unchecked reign of terror across the frontier. The massive manhunt finally cornered the apex predator, stripping him of his freedom and his weapons. The law clamped heavy iron shackles onto his wrists, dragging him away from the open plains and thrusting him into the grim, suffocating confines of the Huntsville Penitentiary. This was the most formidable fortress of punishment in the state of Texas, a brutal facility constructed of thick stone and heavy iron designed explicitly to crush the spirit of the most hardened criminals. For a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating the terms of life and death with a casual twitch of his finger, the sudden absolute loss of autonomy was a radical shock to his system. The prison environment was a highly regimented nightmare of forced labor, armed guards, and crushing isolation. The brutal reality of a 25-year sentence hung over his head, a mandate that promised to rot his youth and vitality away in a damp concrete cell. Yet the deeply entrenched psychopathic mind does not shatter under the pressure of confinement. It calculates, it adapts, and it learns to camouflage itself. He quickly realized that his legendary speed with a revolver and his capacity for sudden, overwhelming violence were entirely useless against the towering stone walls and the rifles of the tower guards. If he relied on his feral instincts, he would die in a cage or swing from a rope. He needed an entirely new weapon to survive and orchestrate his eventual release. He consciously chose the path of absolute systemic deception. He initiated one of the most chilling, calculated, and deeply cynical psychological transformations in the history of the penal system. He deliberately retreated into the very religious texts he had violently rejected during his bloody youth. He requested heavy theological volumes bearing his face in Scripture and adopting the quiet, submissive posture of a man seeking divine forgiveness. The man who had slaughtered over 40 human beings without a flicker of remorse suddenly positioned himself as a devout, repentant student of divinity. He pushed the charade to astonishing lengths, going so far as to take charge of the prison's Sunday school. He stood before a captive congregation of fellow inmates, thieves, rustlers, and killers, delivering solemn sermons and moral instruction with a straight face. The sheer audacity of a mass murderer as well. Lecturing the incarcerated on the tenets of salvation and moral purity was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He knew exactly what the wardens, the parole boards, and the deeply religious Texas public desperately wanted to see. They craved the narrative of redemption. He fed them exactly what they required, wearing the mask of a broken, reformed sinner, while his core remained completely cold, calculating, and untouched by actual guilt. His intellectual charade extended far beyond the confines of the prison chapel. He turned his sharp, predatory focus toward the very judicial system that had placed him behind bars. He ordered dense, complex legal volumes and transformed his small, dark cell into a rigorous academic study. For years, he pored over the intricacies of Texas jurisprudence by the dim light of his cell, dissecting the criminal code, studying historical case law, and thoroughly analyzing the mechanics of legal defense and prosecution. This was not the pursuit of a man seeking to understand the nature of justice or to make amends to a society he had ravaged. It was the strategic reconnaissance of a trapped predator meticulously studying the fences that penned him in. He was learning how to exploit the legal loopholes, how to manipulate a jury's perception, and how to weaponize the complex language of the law just as effectively as he had once weaponized his Colt revolvers. He spent a grueling 14 years perfecting this academic disguise, burying his violent past under layers of legal jargon and theological debate. The prison authorities, thoroughly convinced by his impeccable behavior, his highly visible religious devotion and his scholarly pursuits finally broke under the weight of his deception. They granted him a full pardon. The heavy iron door swung open, and the apex predator walked out into a rapidly modernizing world, armed with a deeply deceptive and highly polished new arsenal. The Texas he returned to in 1894 was fundamentally different, rent from the wild, bleeding frontier he had terrorized in his youth. The major railroads had conquered the vast plains, telegraph wires connected the growing cities, and the brutal open gunfights of the past were being aggressively suppressed by a highly organized modern generation of law enforcement. He understood instinctively that a drifting, heavily armed gunman could no longer survive in this new era. He needed to establish a permanent, untouchable base of operations to shield his underlying nature. He targeted El Paso, a bustling, chaotic border town that straddled the uneasy line between raw frontier violence and burgeoning civic order. He arrived not on a stolen horse covered in trail dust, but as a passenger on a modern train, carrying heavy luggage filled with law books. He immediately set about constructing a new, impenetrable visual identity. He visited the finest tailors in the city, permanently shedding the rough, blood-stained garments of his past. He clothed his scarred, aging body in crisp, meticulously tailored three-piece suits. He purchased gold pocket watches and expensive silk cravats, projecting the visual authority and quiet dignity of a wealthy, educated professional. He did not just dress the part, he actively integrated himself into the very judicial machinery he had once sought to destroy. He sat for the rigorous state legal examinations, utilizing the vast knowledge he had accumulated in his Huntsville cell, and successfully acquired his official license to practice law. He leased a respectable, well-furnished office space in the heart of El Paso, proudly hanging his framed legal credentials on the wall for all prospective clients and visiting lawmen to see. He presented himself to the local judges, the police force, and the citizens of the border town as a reformed, highly capable attorney. He actively sought out clients offering to defend other criminals in the courtroom, utilizing his intimate first-hand knowledge of the criminal underworld to navigate their complex cases. To the outside observer, it was a miraculous, inspiring story of total rehabilitation. The preacher's son had seemingly returned to the light, utilizing his sharp intellect to uphold the very laws he had once violently shattered. The entire performance, however, was a fragile, hollow shell. The expensive worsted wool and the framed certificates could not alter his fundamental bloodthirsty nature. The legal practice was nothing more than a convenient, highly respectable front. A thin veneer of civilization stretched painfully tight over a boiling reservoir of dormant violence. The most glaring evidence of his unbroken psychopathy was his absolute paranoid refusal to disarm. El Paso had enacted strict, highly enforced ordinances prohibiting the carrying of firearms within the city limits, an aggressive effort to civilize the dusty streets and curb the localized violence. He completely ignored the very law he had sworn an oath to uphold. Beneath the elegant tailored cut of his expensive coats, he continually carried his heavy loaded revolvers. He walked the civilized streets of the city with the cold, heavy steel pressed tightly against his ribs, maintaining a constant physical connection to the bloodshed of his youth. He did not merely carry the weapons for passive defense against old enemies. In the quiet privacy of his legal office or the dimly lit corners of his boarding house, the supposed intellectual engaged in obsessive, chilling rituals that betrayed his true intent. He continually practiced the complex, highly lethal mechanics of the border roll. This was an advanced, incredibly dangerous gun handling technique utilized exclusively by hardened killers, designed to feign surrender by handing over a weapon butt first to a lawman, only to seamlessly spin the heavy revolver around the trigger guard, dropping it instantly into a firing position to execute the arresting officer. He drilled this maneuver relentlessly, his hands moving with the terrifying practiced muscle memory of a man who fully intended to kill again. The respectable lawyer in the silk vest was a ghost. The mass murderer from the Clay County brush was fully alive, pacing behind the heavy oak desk, his eyes constantly scanning the room, waiting for the inevitable moment when the legal arguments would fail, the facade would shatter, and the talking would finally stop. The suit was a calculated lie. The law degree was a convenient prop, and the violence was simply lying dormant, waiting for a single spark to ignite the powder. The illusion of the reformed intellectual could not withstand the suffocating heat and the relentless temptations of the El Paso saloons. The crisp, tailored suits he had purchased to cement his new identity quickly lost their sharp creases, becoming perpetually stained with spilled whiskey and cigar ash. He had established a legal practice, complete with framed credentials and a formal office, attempting to project the image of a decent intellectual. However, the reality was a rapid, humiliating descent back into the very vices that had always defined his existence. He spent virtually no time actively arguing cases in front of a judge, abandoning the quiet dignity of the courtroom for the chaotic, smoke-filled interiors of the local bars. The man who had spent 14 years meticulously studying the law in a prison cell found that he fundamentally lacked the patience and the moral fortitude to actually practice it. His true nature remained that of a gambling addict and a heavy drinker. The alcohol was not a casual indulgence. It was a desperate, heavy medication required to numb a nervous system permanently wired for extreme violence. When the whiskey flooded his veins, the carefully constructed facade of the civilized attorney completely dissolved, revealing the raw, unrepentant predator lurking just beneath the surface. The citizens of El Paso quickly learned to recognize the terrifying physical transformation that accompanied his heavy drinking. Witnesses and contemporaries noted a distinct, chilling change in his features when the alcohol took hold. His eyes, normally masked by the practiced composure of a lawyer, would become flushed and dilated, taking on a serpentine quality, cold, unblinking, and entirely devoid of human empathy. In these frequent, heavily intoxicated states, the sheer psychological weight of his past actions began to crush his sanity. He had personally extinguished the lives of over 40 men during his bloody youth. The families, brothers, and sons of those victims were scattered across the Texas frontier, and his mind, warped by the alcohol, became convinced that they were all converging on El Paso to exact their revenge. He lived in a state of absolute suffocating paranoia. He could not walk down a crowded street without scanning the rooftops and the alleyways, his right hand constantly hovering near the heavy steel concealed beneath his coat. The fame that had once fed his massive ego now acted as a suffocating noose, ensuring that he could never fade into the anonymity of the crowd. Every stranger who walked through the swinging doors of a saloon was a potential assassin carrying a shotgun and a grievance. This extreme paranoia transformed his nights into a waking nightmare. The boarding house where he rented a room became a theater of his own deeply entrenched madness. His landlord reported deeply disturbing, erratic behavior that completely shattered the illusion of the quiet professional. In the dead of night, when the rest of the city was asleep, the aging killer could not find rest. The landlord would hear the heavy, measured footsteps pacing the wooden floorboards of the dark hallways for hours on end. If a sudden noise broke the silence, a stray dog barking in the alley, a carriage rolling past on the dirt road, or a simple, unexpected knock on the heavy wooden front door, the reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. He would violently dive behind the nearest piece of heavy furniture, his revolver instantly drawn and leveled at the doorway, his breathing ragged, and his serpentine eyes wide with terror. He was a prisoner in his own mind, serving a sentence far more brutal and inescapable than the 14 years he had spent in Huntsville. The ghosts of the men he had slaughtered were crowding into his small room, denying him the basic human necessity of sleep. The exhaustion and the alcohol fueled a hair-trigger temper that made him an incredibly volatile presence at the local gambling Abel's. He was a chronic, desperate gambler who sought the adrenaline rush of the high-stakes games to replace the visceral thrill of his past gunfights. But the disciplined, calculating nature required for successful card playing was entirely absent. He played recklessly, fueled by a deeply arrogant belief in his own invincibility. When the cards inevitably turned against him, the intellectual lawyer vanished entirely. He refused to accept the financial losses gracefully. He viewed a bad hand not as a matter of mathematical probability, but as a personal insult. The extreme paranoia dictated his every interaction. He was ready to draw his gun and threaten the lives of the other players over nothing more than a displeasing look across the felt table. If a dealer hesitated, or if another gambler simply glanced at him with an expression he deemed disrespectful, his hand would blur toward his hidden weapon. He would aggressively demand his lost money back from the center of the table, utilizing the terrifying weight of his murderous reputation to enforce compliance. The other men in the saloons, well aware that this was the man who had killed over 40 people, would freeze in absolute terror, sliding the coins across the table rather than risking a bullet to the chest. He was extorting his fellow citizens under the guise of gambling, utilizing the sheer threat of sudden, extreme violence to fund his downward spiral. The tragic irony of his final years was absolute. He had fought desperately to escape the physical prison of Huntsville, only to lock himself inside a psychological cage of alcoholism, gambling addiction, and unrelenting terror. The crisp lawyer suit was now nothing more than a shroud, wrapping a decaying paranoid killer who was rapidly running out of time and luck on the dusty streets of El Paso. The green felt of the faro tables and the wooden rims of the dice trays in El Paso became his new killing fields. He did not engage in the mathematics of gambling or the strategy of the cards. He engaged in pure, unfiltered psychological warfare. When the stakes grew high and the whiskey thinned his already fragile patience, the veneer of the educated, respectable lawyer evaporated completely. He was the absolute embodiment of treachery. If the dealer pulled a winning card for the house, or if the dice did not fall in his favor, he did not sigh and slide his chips across the table like a civilized man. He slid his hand beneath his tailored coat. The ambient noise of the saloon, the clinking of glasses, the lively piano music, the low murmur of conversation would instantly die. The silence that followed was heavier and far more terrifying than the smoke hanging in the rafters. He would level his cold, unblinking, bloodshot eyes at the dealer, his hand gripping the hidden steel of his revolver, and explicitly challenge the integrity of the game. He relied entirely on the paralyzing fear his dark history generated. The men sitting across from him were painfully aware that this aging lawyer was a volatile psychopath who had shot a man through a hotel wall for snoring. They slid their coins back across the table, choosing the humiliation of extortion over the absolute certainty of a bullet to the chest. He was a parasite, feeding on the terror of unarmed men, desperately trying to project strength, while his internal reality was entirely consumed by panic and decay. This terrifying, erratic behavior in the El Paso saloons was not born in a vacuum. It was the rotting culmination of a lifetime of violent entitlement, heavily burdened by a catastrophic karmic debt that had already demanded a horrific price. The most devastating consequence of his actions did not strike him directly. It completely annihilated his own bloodline. The catalyst for this tragedy had occurred years earlier, during his bloody youth, with the murder of Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb in the town of Comanche. Webb was a widely respected lawman, a physical representation of the encroaching civic order that the young killer violently rejected. During a tense, sudden confrontation on the street, he did what he always did. He drew his weapon faster, firing a fatal round that left the deputy bleeding out in the Texas dirt. But the assassination of Charles Webb was a fatal, monumental miscalculation. It did not inspire the usual paralyzing fear among the townsfolk. It ignited an uncontrollable feral outrage. A massive, heavily armed mob formed almost instantly, a terrifying tidal wave of vigilante justice demanding immediate, absolute retribution. Possessing the hypervigilant, cowardly survival instincts of a hunted animal, he managed to slip through the tightening dragnet, vanishing into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness, leaving his own community behind to face the wrath he had provoked. The enraged mob, deprived of their primary target, did not disperse. Their thirst for blood was absolute, and it immediately sought the nearest available substitute. They turned their blind, terrifying fury toward the people who shared his last name. The mob descended upon his older brother, Joe Hardin, and two of his cousins. These men were not hardened outlaws. They were not participants in the murder of the deputy. They were functioning, established members of the community, violently dragged from their homes in the dead of night by a faceless sea of angry men. The mob did not offer a trial, a judge, or the opportunity for a legal defense. They offered only the brutal, primitive, and immediate justice of the frontier. The vigilantes hauled Joe Hardin and the terrified cousins to the nearest sturdy tree limbs. The rough hemp ropes were thrown over the branches, the heavy knots tightened around the necks of innocent men, and they were violently hoisted into the air. They were left to strangle in the dark, their bodies swaying in the wind, a grotesque public monument to the sins of their missing brother. The sheer brutality of the lynching sent a chilling, unmistakable message across the state. The law of cause and effect had finally caught up with the preacher's son, striking him precisely where he could not defend himself with a revolver. The execution of his own flesh and blood was a crushing psychological weight that he could never outrun. The man who boasted in his autobiography of feeling absolutely no remorse for the strangers he gunned down was permanently shackled to the horrific reality that his own reckless arrogance had directly caused the agonizing deaths of his brother and cousins. He had, through his own insatiable bloodlust, essentially tied the nooses around their necks himself. This was the invisible, agonizing burden he carried with him into the solitary confinement of the Huntsville Penitentiary, and it was the very same burden he dragged into his dark boarding house room in El Paso. It was the absolute root of the suffocating paranoia that kept him pacing the hallways at night, jumping at every shadow. The alcohol he consumed in massive daily quantities was a desperate, ultimately failing attempt to drown out the memory of the mob and the horrifying image of his brother swinging from a tree. His hyper-aggression at the faro tables, his pathetic need to threaten unarmed dealers and extort money, was a frantic effort to exert a tiny measure of control over a life that had completely, irreversibly unraveled. He was a hollowed-out shell, rotting from the inside out, completely unaware that the pendulum of violence he had set in motion decades ago had already reached its apex and was swinging back with terrifying speed to strike him down. The sweltering heat of August in El Paso did nothing to suppress the simmering violence that pulsed through the border town, a tension that inevitably collected in the crowded, smoke-filled interiors of the local saloons. The man who had spent 14 years meticulously studying legal volumes in a prison cell to engineer his release was now rapidly orchestrating his own demise. The sweltering heat of August in El Paso only thickened the tension inside the crowded saloons. Hardin, consumed by the suffocating paranoia of his past, firmly believed his lethal reputation was an impenetrable shield. Operating under the fatal delusion that he was the only predator left in a modernizing town, he routinely flashed his concealed weapons over petty card disputes, completely unaware that this blinding arrogance was about to trigger his final catastrophic confrontation. His legal practice was a ghost town, while his presence in the saloons was a constant, terrifying reality. He navigated these crowded rooms with the crushing paranoia of a man who had personally slaughtered over 40 people during his blood-soaked youth. He firmly believed that his lethal reputation formed an impenetrable shield, a psychological armor that would paralyze any potential threats. He was so consumed by his own terrifying mythology that he frequently drew his concealed weapons to threaten unarmed men over the slightest, perceived slights, or minor disagreements regarding the rules of a card game. He operated under the fatal delusion that he was the only predator left in a town, rapidly transitioning toward modern law and order. This blinding arrogance led him directly into a catastrophic, entirely avoidable confrontation. The catalyst was remarkably petty, devoid of any grand frontier romance or high-stakes robbery. A young police officer named John Selman Jr. had legally arrested a woman closely associated with the aging killer. Rather than utilizing the legal training he so proudly advertised to address the arrest in a court of law, he reverted instantly to the feral instincts of the brush country. He publicly confronted the young officer, delivering a series of aggressive, unmistakable death threats. It was a monumental miscalculation. He had failed to account for the boy's father. John Selman Sr. was an aging constable, but he was also a ardent, deeply experienced former outlaw who possessed a history nearly as violent as the man currently threatening his son. Selman Sr. did not operate by the outdated theatrical code of the duel, and he certainly did not intend to wait for a paranoid, heavily intoxicated serial killer to make the first move. The threat against his bloodline required an immediate, permanent, and surgically precise elimination of the problem. On the night of August 19th, 1895, the Acme Saloon was a chaotic symphony of clinking glasses, low conversations, and the sharp rattle of gambling equipment. He stood at the bar, his tailored suit absorbing the ambient heat and the smell of stale beer. He was completely engrossed in a high-stakes game of dice, his attention fiercely locked onto the green felt and the tumbling ivory cubes. The suffocating paranoia that dictated his every waking moment, the hypervigilance that kept him pacing the hallways of his boarding house late into the night had momentarily lapsed, entirely eclipsed by the intoxicating rush of the gamble. He gathered the dice into his cupped hand, shaking them with the desperate energy of a severe addict chasing a fleeting victory. He threw them across the wood and spoke his final words into the smoky, crowded room. 4 6s to beat. He never saw the swinging doors of the saloon part. He never heard the heavy, measured footsteps approaching him from behind. John Selman Sr. walked directly through the sawdust, raising a heavy-caliber revolver. There was no theatrical challenge issued, no demand to turn and face his executioner. Selman simply leveled the steel barrel inches from the back of the gambler's skull and pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot instantly silenced the saloon. The physical devastation was clinical and absolute. The heavy lead bullet tore directly through the back of his head, obliterating the brain that had calculated decades of murder and violently exited through his left eye. The eye impact severed his consciousness instantly, dropping the most feared gunman in Texas straight down into the dirt and spilled whiskey of the saloon floor. The immediate aftermath of the assassination stripped away the final, desperate layers of the mythology he had spent his entire life constructing. When the stunned patrons and the local authorities gathered around the bleeding corpse, they discovered a detail that served as the ultimate humiliating punchline to his violent existence. He had authored a thick autobiography, specifically to cement his legacy, endlessly boasting of his lightning-fast draw and his unparalleled ability to outgun any opponent in a face-to-face confrontation. Yet as he lay dead on the floorboards, the absolute failure of his lethal prowess was exposed for the entire town to witness. His hands had never even reached the grip of his weapon. In the split second before the bullet shattered his skull, his legendary reflexes had proven entirely useless. The investigators found his concealed revolver hopelessly entangled in his trouser suspenders inside his pocket. The supreme, untouchable killer of the American West died awkwardly fumbling at his own clothing, utterly defenseless and completely unaware of his own execution. The subsequent medical examination cemented the brutal reality of the event. 3 distinct physicians, S.G. Sherrod, W. Envillis, and Allward White, conducted the autopsy and signed the official coroner's report. Their forensic findings were irrefutable, completely dismantling any subsequent claims by Selman that the shooting was an act of preemptive self-defense during a standoff. The trajectory of the bullet provided an undeniable historical truth. It was a cold, calculated execution delivered directly into the blind spot of a distracted man. The expensive suit was soaked in blood. The law degree hanging in his empty office was rendered a complete mockery, and the terrifying reputation that had shielded him for decades evaporated into the hot Texas night. The lifeless body lying on the floor of the Acme Saloon was the absolute, undeniable conclusion to a lifetime of systemic violence. John Wesley Hardin did not die as a misunderstood rebel, a tragic victim of circumstance, or a romanticized anti-hero fighting against a corrupt system. He died as a parasite who had finally exhausted his host. The universe operates on a cold, unyielding arithmetic, a brutal ledger of cause and effect that cannot be manipulated by sharp tailoring or legal terminology. A man who spent his youth ambushing rivals, shooting unarmed strangers in the back, and orchestrating violence over the most trivial of bruised egos met his end in the exact same cowardly, merciless fashion. The legacy he leaves behind is not a legend to be admired, but a stark, blood-soaked warning permanently etched into the historical record. The cruelty inflicted upon the world does not simply vanish into the past. It waits patiently in the shadows, holding a loaded gun, inevitably demanding repayment in the exact same currency.